I currently serve as your 2021-2022 Student Government Association President, as well as your student regent. And I would love to welcome everyone out to our event today, and thank you for masking up. I'd also like to welcome our virtual audience, which includes some of our Northern Kentucky University classes and students from other campuses around Kentucky, including Berea College, Morehead State University, Owensboro Community and Technical College, as well as Spalding University, as we celebrate the 2021 Constitution Day together. On this day in 1787, the founding fathers signed the US Constitution and set our nation on a course that would show the world that free people could govern themselves. They gave us that powerful preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do obtain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now notice, they wrote to form a more perfect union, not a perfect union, meaning that our work is going to continue today to perfect our union because it is not finished and we are called to make our union better. So let's remember that as we move forward today through our session. All right, now in a few minutes, we will introduce our guest, Secretary of State, Michael Adams. But before we do that, everyone get out your smartphone. I know you have one, so get it out. All right, raise your hand if you have Twitter. All right, so everyone go on Twitter for me and hashtag KY Constitution Day and let them know that you're out here at this event as we celebrate together. Everybody got it? Okay, I'm gonna look on my phone to see if you all tweeted. Now, can you please go to the website, Kahoot? It is up here listed on the screen, and I'm going to give you all a little quiz as we start our day off. All right, once you get on the website, Kahoot, you will go and type in this game pin that is listed above, which is 336-4560. Y'all are very technologically advanced, moving fast. And for our virtual audience, please join as well. All right, I'll give everybody a few more seconds. All right, everybody good? We're gonna go ahead and get started. All right, the Constitution Day quiz. The main purpose of the Constitution is to declare independence from Great Britain, to establish a new government and to designate the powers and limits, to enumerate individual rights as well, or to provide for the separation of church and state. All right, okay, we did a good job. So the correct answer is to establish a new government and to designate the powers and limits. Now, if you got something wrong, that is definitely okay. Make sure you take notes because this is a learning and growing experience for everyone. Now on to our next question. Oh, Michael, you in the lead. All right, what do the first three articles of the Constitution accomplish? Outlining the powers of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, list the main reasons for separation from Great Britain, clearly define the fundamental rights of all American citizens, establish the US Capitol in Washington, DC. I know this answer, y'all. All right. So the correct answer is to outline the powers of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Okay, Colin S. Done moved up. All right, the maximum time a president can serve in this office is 2 years, 8 years, 4 years, and 10 years. Be careful, this is a tricky question. Y'all can't be cheating. I hear whispering. All right, so the correct answer is 10 years. I cannot tell you why, but we will look it up and I will let you know. Okay, Chris K. All right, our next question. What does the supremacy clause in Article 5 of the US Constitution accomplish? Declare the United States the greatest and most powerful nation on earth, establish the Supreme Court as the supreme authority in times of crisis, establishes the president as the supreme authority in times of crises, or establish the Constitution as the highest law within the US borders. All right, so 44 people got it correct. So it establishes the Constitution as the highest law written within the US borders. Fee, you're on fire. I see a little fire sign next to you. All right, the 26th Amendment of the Constitution assures the vote to citizens who are 18 or older, protects free speech, eliminates slavery, or guarantees equal rights to women. All right, so the correct answer is assures the vote to citizens who are 18 or older. Now, this is the last question. What does democracy mean to you? There is no wrong answer. So I see equal treatment, the choice to vote, representation, freedom to choose, voice of the people, elected officials, inclusive citizenship. There are a lot of amazing answers up there, and thank you all for participating. Now that we have ended the quiz, we're gonna go for third place. Jasmine, let's clap it up. Okay, see? 5 out of 5. Who is it? Okay, Eunice. Okay. Congratulations to all of our winners. Now, if you didn't get the best of score, it's okay. That just means we need to do a little bit of studying and practice. All right. Now, from a show of hands, we're gonna do thumbs up, thumbs to the side, or thumbs down. How do you think you did on the quiz? Bless you. For anyone who was to the side or down, are you gonna take the time to learn and enhance your knowledge in these areas? Okay, great, because I need a study group, so if you wanna help me too, I'll be there. All right, so now we're going to get interactive later as well with question and answers, and our virtual audience will be able to ask questions as well using the Q&A function on your screen. But right now, I would like to introduce Northern Kentucky University's provost, Mr. Matt Cecil. Dr. Cecil started at Northern Kentucky University this summer as NKU's Chief Academic Officer. He came to us from Minnesota State University, Mankato, where he was interim provost. Dr. Cecil worked for a time as a newspaper reporter and then as a political press secretary and corporate communications specialist. He left those careers for one in higher education. Earning his PhD in mass communications, he's a media historian and a leading scholar of FBI history during the J. Edgar Hoover era. Dr. Cecil will soon introduce our guests, but first I would love to bring you to the stage.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Welcome everyone, and good morning. Constitution Day, when we celebrate September 17th, 1787, the signing of the US Constitution, is an opportune occasion to remind ourselves that democracy isn't automatic. In fact, maintaining a healthy democracy is a lot of work, and education is key to that work. Today's topic reminded me of a quote from something I read almost 25 years ago in graduate school. As many of you may know, John Dewey was one of the greatest American scholars and thinkers of the 20th century. In his 1916 book, Democracy and Education, Dewey wrote, and I quote, "Democracy has to be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife." At NKU, and I think I can speak for other public universities in Kentucky, we are proud of our role in renewing democracy with each generation of students that comes to our campus. And we're proud as well to welcome our esteemed Kentucky Secretary of State to our campus today. Secretary of State Michael G. Adams is a graduate of the University of Louisville and Harvard Law School. Like about half of our students at NKU, he was the first person in his family to graduate from college. Secretary Adams has worked for national leaders like Senator Mitch McConnell and Vice President Mike Pence, and he was elected as our Secretary of State in 2019. In 2020, Secretary Adams implemented procedures enabling Kentucky citizens to safely cast votes during the pandemic. Those changes included excuse-free absentee voting and 3 weeks of open polls, and the result was a record voter turnout, and Secretary Adams' plan has rightly been hailed as a national model for voting during the pandemic. We are all grateful for your work on behalf of voters in our state, Secretary Adams. And so now, on behalf of President Ashish Vaidya, it's my honor to welcome the 86th Secretary of State of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, Michael Adams.
One moment.
You all could just bear with us for a few minutes so we can get them mic'd up and ready to go.
Thanks a lot. Good morning. They had to mic me up so I can be in front of the big Steve Jobs screen. So worked out great. Don't give me too much credit for color coordinating my face mask and my attire today. Purely luck. Thank you for the Northern Kentucky face mask. And thank you for being here as well. You were much better about showing up on Friday morning than I was when I was in college. I'm grateful for this opportunity. I'll confess, Constitution Day is not my favorite holiday. It's Independence Day, but Constitution Day is a close second. This has been a crazy year and a half for all of us. I'd like to walk you through my 20 months as your chief election official and offer some perspective on the lessons I've learned and where we might go from here. I was sworn in as Kentucky's chief election official on January 6th last year. When I got to the part in my oath where I said, "So help me God," what I really meant was, "So help me God." Standing in the shadow of Lincoln in the Capitol Rotunda, I felt so small and insignificant and absolutely terrified of failure. From the very beginning, even before I was sworn in, I made it a point to get a broad range of opinions and advice, including from ideological opponents and others who didn't support my campaign. I grew up the only Republican in a Democratic family, which was pretty good preparation for going to Harvard Law School too. Avoiding groupthink is important for good policy, and even just for basic empathy. When I put together a transition team, I included Republicans, Democrats, and independents. I didn't ask them if they voted for me, but at least one member didn't. I know because he went out of his way to tell me that. To some extent, every elected official ought to be seen as fair, objective, and nonpartisan. That is more true of the Secretary of State than of anyone. If the chief election official is seen as partial or partisan, that is uniquely destabilizing and creates or worsens a crisis of confidence in our elections and thus in our government. You might think all of this is obvious, but unfortunately, in today's polarized politics, it's counterintuitive. Too often, listening and open-mindedness are seen as weaknesses at best or treasonous at worst. The signature issue of my campaign was passing a photo ID to vote law. When it comes to election integrity, to me, it seems entirely appropriate to ask someone to prove his or her identity before voting in our elections. But what seems to me like just common sense is controversial to others. So after the election, I began a dialogue with the ACLU and other left-leaning groups who oppose photo ID to hear them out, understand their concerns, and at least try to address as many of them as I could. It led to better policy. It led to success in court when the law was challenged. And it showed both my adversaries and the public at large that the chief election official represents and serves all Kentuckians. When Senate Bill 2, the photo ID bill, passed at the beginning of March 2020, I was pleased that my #1 campaign promise had been fulfilled. But I was also a little let down. What was I going to do for the next 46 months of my term? Well, I found something to keep me busy. I think we all remember how virtually overnight the coronavirus changed everything, changed our lives. To give you my perspective, on March 9th, 2020, I participated in an hour-long KET news program and was not asked a single question about how the virus might impact our elections. That's not a criticism, it just wasn't on our radars yet. Just 7 days later, on March 16th, I was standing next to the governor at a press conference announcing that we had jointly agreed to delay Kentucky's primary election from May 19th to June 23rd. When I took office, Kentucky's emergency powers law provided for the Secretary of State and the governor jointly to change the time or place of an election during a state of emergency. The law did not allow for us to change the manner, though, of the election. It soon became clear that the challenges we faced could not be resolved by just buying a lot of personal protective equipment. The governor issued stay-at-home orders, and even if they had been lifted before the election, the reality was that many voters would not feel comfortable leaving their homes to stand in line and vote in person. There was also the problem that our supply of volunteer poll workers evaporated overnight. At a time when Kentuckians, but especially seniors who are most of our poll workers, were strongly advised, even ordered to stay at home, the people that we needed to staff our voting locations were off the table. Also, we lost most of our voting locations. Who wanted the liability risk of opening up their premises to the general public for a 12-hour day? Not many. Something had to be done. The first step was to get the power to do something. Although I have a corner office in the state capitol, I'm actually on paper the least powerful constitutional officer. The only clear constitutional authority I have is a directive to attest to the acts of the governor and keep a journal thereof. Over time, the Secretary of State has become the chief election official by statute. But even that is somewhat form over substance, because under my predecessor, the legislature stripped this office from chairing the State Board of Elections or even casting votes there. I thought the best solution was to ask the legislature to amend the emergency powers law that lets the governor and the Secretary of State jointly change the time or the place of an election to add the words "or manner." That was the biggest decision I've made in my 20 months in office, and it required me to overrule the unanimous recommendation of my senior staff. They doubted whether the election could be saved, and whether I should own it, and whether I should blindly assume that I'd be able to work with the governor, who previously had not included us in election-related policy matters. They also recognized that in today's poisonous politics, working across party lines, even in a crisis, prompts enormous blowback. Fortunately, I was able to persuade legislators. One of my proudest moments in this job was getting Republicans and Democrats to come together. Republicans who were not very keen on expanding this governor's powers, and Democrats who were suspicious of me after Senate Bill 2. Here, even more than in the photo ID debate, the efforts that I took to be inclusive paid off. Then and now, while I'm proud to be the father of voter ID in Kentucky, I'm even more proud of this legislation. Then the governor vetoed it. I was stunned. It was no accident that my legislation didn't place these emergency powers in my hands alone. I liked the happy coincidence that the legislation we were augmenting required both the governor and the Secretary of State to reach an agreement, and that he and I happened to belong to different political parties. That meant that we could work together and find common ground acceptable to voters on both sides. Our country had already seen what happens when elections fall victim to partisan brinksmanship. In Wisconsin, the Democratic governor and Republican legislature fought it out in court, all the way to the US Supreme Court, which issued a ruling just hours before the Wisconsin primary was to commence. The result was that the election rules were not clear until the last minute, and voters got disenfranchised, and in some cases got COVID-19. Another intangible but real harm from partisanship in election administration is that the half of voters who end up on the losing side feel that the game is rigged. We saw something similar in Ohio. There too were disputes between branches of government, and election rules decided not by the politically accountable branches, but by judges. That primary election was called off, and then put on again, and then called off again. Voters deserve better than this. My number one goal for this election and for my term of office has been to enhance public confidence in our elections. At first, it dawned on me I needed Andy Beshear to help me with that. Initially, I was spurned. Even though he is one of 7 executive branch constitutional officers, the governor's veto message flatly stated that he has, quote, supreme executive power. At a time he was saying every day at a press conference that we were all on the same team, Team Kentucky, he exercised his authority to keep the chief election official, who came to office with deep national experience and expertise in election policy, off the team that would administer an election in a pandemic. I'm unique among Republicans in Frankfort for having rarely criticized the governor in public. But on this occasion, I let him have it. I wasn't just personally offended. I thought this veto undermined and threatened to destabilize our election system. It was not hard to find both Republican and Democratic votes to override the governor's senseless, indefensible veto. But that veto still did real damage in the short term by tanking negotiations we had already begun on how we might save the primary election. Several days passed. Eventually, the governor and I, we had a civil but tense conversation. Then we had another conversation that was a little bit better. Eventually, we had a deal. Expanded absentee voting, 2 weeks of early in-person voting, and other changes. I can admit now, these were all absolutely necessary. And I would have taken them even without any concessions at all. But in an effort to reassure conservative voters and not destroy my effectiveness in supervising the election and in governing for the rest of my term, I needed a sweetener. The governor agreed to expansion of my ability to proactively reach voters who have moved out of our state and get their consent to remove them from our voter rolls. Like voter ID, it's an issue that I ran on and I promised I would fix. This agreement moved us ahead on getting our voter rolls in compliance with federal and state law. I was pretty confident this would all be well received by voters across the spectrum, including Republicans. It wasn't, not yet anyway. I learned here that leadership is something that we all aspire to, but it's not one particular thing. It's different things in different forms that require different skills. For me, it had 3 components. First, develop a policy. I did that by making phone calls across the state to county clerks of both parties and across the country to secretaries of state of both parties. I was able to draw on what I'd learned as a political law attorney, working in hundreds of elections across all 50 states. Having seen how other states run elections, the methods they use gave me a big toolbox full of ideas. Second, sell the policy to those who have to implement it. Here, the governor, the county clerks, the legislators. The third stage was the hardest. Sell the policy to the public. As of late April 2020, the then president of the United States routinely attacked the expansion and the expanders of voting access. Specifically, those states and state officials who expanded voting by mail. There were big differences between what I offered, expanded absentee voting, and the mail-in voting that the president criticized. For one, the Western states that conduct elections mostly by mail automatically register to vote names that come up in a government database. I don't like that. For another, those states automatically mail out ballots to anyone who then shows up on those voter rolls. I don't like that either. Even if I did like it for California, here in Kentucky, that approach would have been infeasible because I inherited voter rolls that were wildly out of compliance with state and federal law. A system like that actually would contribute to election fraud. Unfortunately, the presidential tweets at issue did not draw these technical distinctions. And just 10 days after the enactment of my photo ID to vote bill, I found myself totally isolated, a man without a party, as grassroots Republicans went nuts on me. They conflated mail-in voting with absentee voting, the latter of which requires voters to proactively register and proactively apply for their ballots with proof of identity. And they didn't know or didn't care that I had made huge progress on cleaning up our voter rolls. Democrats were still angry about photo ID, so they didn't like or trust me either. So I was basically toast. Compounding the problem of public persuasion, not just for me, but for the governor, the attorney general, any public official, is that we've been limited in our ability to travel our districts, our states, meet with groups, and make our case. Although I serve everyone equally, and I spent the next 2 months talking to any group I could find that was having a Zoom somewhere, I especially had to find a way to reach Republicans, restore my credibility with them, and persuade them to vote by absentee ballot. With nearly all of our poll workers and voting locations suddenly unavailable, we were on track to be the next Wisconsin if I didn't find a way to detoxify absentee voting. I began with a constitutional argument. Conservatives like me love to cite the Constitution as it's written as a source of authority. I noted that the right to vote in person is plainly stated in our state constitution, and that I had defended that right in my negotiations with the governor, who wanted to restrict in-person voting. But I also noted that absentee voting is also a right in our state constitution. And one could be a conservative, as I am, and a strict constructionist, as I am, and still advocate for facilitating absentee voting. Also, I gave a lot of thought to improvements that we could make so that absentee voting could be more secure and seen as more secure. We created an absentee ballot request portal, which increased voter convenience, and also gave the voter a new window of transparency into the election system, allowing her to track her absentee ballot and allowing me to track ballots as well. For the first time, the chief election official was now able to surveil absentee voting statewide in real time. The portal also gave us the ability to verify a voter's identity against her driver's license, which had never been done previously. We also put together video instructions on filling out an absentee ballot. Of course, we wanted voters to fill out the ballots correctly so they could be counted. But I also wanted to subtly show voters that signatures are required on absentee ballot envelopes, and then each one is vigorously compared to the voter's signature of record. In time, the opposition began to die down, partly because other shiny objects intervened, partly because of our efforts, and partly because of word of mouth. It got around how easy and effective the portal was and how stringent our ballot integrity requirements were. We were still anxious about pulling this off successfully. It was then that I got some unexpected help from an unlikely source. In the days leading up to the June 23rd election, several coastal celebrities began attacking our state with a social media campaign, #AllEyesOnKentucky. They didn't know or didn't care that in the span of 2 months, we had done more with wider absentee voting and 2 weeks of early voting to expand voter access than had been done in 100+ years of Kentucky history. Instead, they tweeted obsessively that with the significant reduction in in-person voting locations brought about by the pandemic, that Kentucky was engaged in Jim Crow voter suppression tactics aimed at hurting African Americans. By Kentucky, I mean the Republican Secretary of State of Kentucky. Other states with Democratic secretaries of state had made similar changes without being thus attacked. Then Hillary Clinton joined in. That took the out-of-state hate to a whole other level. Suddenly our phones, the State Board of Elections phones, the county clerk's phones were jammed with hateful comments from New Yorkers and Californians, and even death threats. Ironically, Hillary Clinton and her ilk disenfranchised our voters, because with all these calls coming in from out of state, Kentuckians who were calling us with questions of how or where to vote were not able to get through. At the risk of sounding cynical, I saw Hillary Clinton attacking us as, on some level, good news. First, it gave me a well-known, deeply disliked, soundly discredited politician from the other side that I could counter. This helped me convince Republicans that our approach to the election must be pretty good after all. Even more important, it prompted the state Democratic Party, our left-leaning major newspapers, the leading voice in the state NAACP, and others on the progressive side here in our state to call Hillary Clinton out on her falsehoods and to defend our state and what we had done. The state came together in a way it hadn't in a long time. And that enhanced public confidence in our system and folks' willingness to accept our new model. The primary election was a great success, not just by my terms, but in the eyes of the Washington Post and the New York Times and other flagship influencers from the Beltway and the coasts that had just spent several days attacking Kentuckians as 4 million racist rednecks. Not only did we pull off the first successful election held during the pandemic, we were hailed as a national model. When was the last time Kentucky was a national model in anything? We not only had a safe election with high turnout and no spike in COVID cases, we also had a clean election, and the myth that we'd have mass voter fraud did not pan out. There wasn't much time or place for a victory lap. By the end of July, we had the outline of a general election plan ready for negotiations with the governor. First, we needed to keep expanded absentee in some form to protect our elderly and those with pre-existing conditions. But if 75% of voters voted absentee in the general election as they had in the primary, we would exceed our load capacity and our system would crash. We needed in-person early voting, not absentee voting, to be the primary release valve to aid against overcrowding the polls on election day. We also needed poll workers. We engaged in outreach with the private sector. The State Bar Association agreed to give continuing legal education credit to lawyers who volunteered to be poll workers. Craft brewers, including here in Campbell County, put SOS from your SOS labels on their beer cans and bottles, advertising our recruitment effort. We created a poll worker volunteer portal on our website, and we found over 5,000 poll workers that way. I approached the governor in mid-August with a new plan, and I'd hoped that the highly politicized expansion of absentee voting had somewhat been reduced, and that my side of the aisle would be pleased with the outcome. Again, I was wrong. The backlash from the grassroots flared up again, but worse was the backlash from some GOP legislators. These are my friends. In many cases, people who had given my campaign donations from their own campaigns at a time when I was an underdog that few took seriously and gave any chance to win an upset against one of Kentucky's most famous and beloved figures. I could handle mean girl web comments and tweets and so forth, but backlash from some of my allies in the Capitol really hurt. In September, a poll came out that asked Kentuckians how they plan to vote in the general election. 25% said absentee ballot. 13% said early voting. 56% said on election day. Had that happened, we would have had lines until 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. and a public health disaster. We had to find a way to sell these changes, but especially the early voting. Too much absentee or too much election day voting, and the system would collapse. With the primary as precedent, I followed the same steps. I spoke to any group I could find and made the case. As with absentee voting, I had to make a political spin on early voting to sell it to my side and avoid an unmitigated disaster. I noted that Republicans, especially in the current political environment, want to vote in person. So I sold early voting as an expansion of the right to vote in person. Hey, Republicans, I get it. You want to vote in person. Now you have 19 convenient days to do so. Early voting worked like a charm. Voters loved it. We launched a PSA campaign to push early voting on TV, radio, internet, billboards, even bus stop benches. What enabled early voting most of all, though, was positive word of mouth. People told their families, their friends, and TV reporters, early voting is great. I was in and out in 5 minutes. As early voting proceeded, I noticed something. Even in very Republican areas, actually, especially in very Republican areas, early voting was a hit. That was a surprise because I'd assumed, and the polling showed, that conservative voters were most resistant to change in how we ran the election and disproportionately wanted to vote in person on election day. But the two counties that had the highest proportion of early voters were Casey and Clinton counties, two rock-ribbed GOP counties since the Civil War. Increasingly, local Republicans, including government officials, didn't just praise how we were running the election in a continuing pandemic. They actually encouraged me to try to make some of these changes, including early voting, permanent. On November 3rd, our election concluded smoothly, a clean election with the most votes ever cast. With that over, and with this year an off year, we had a window of time to contemplate what changes we'd made that would translate well in a non-pandemic election environment in the future. Then I approached the same legislature that had been so critical of me just a few months before and pointed to the success and was able to persuade them to make permanent changes in our laws for 4 key features that we implemented administratively in 2020. First, expanded in-person voting. The new law offers 3 days of early in-person voting, including a Saturday, making it easier for working people to vote. From 1891 through 2019, the year I was elected, Kentucky offered its citizens only 1 day to go vote. It wasn't always this way. Our first 11 US presidents were elected under a system of early voting, a process that brought us Washington, Jefferson, Madison, not too shabby. In 2020, we saw a significant uptick in turnout the last few days before Election Day. A 4-day voting period actually mirrors the voting period that was provided in Kentucky's first 2 constitutions. Second, the Voter Services Portal. The portal first verifies the identity of absentee ballot applicants, then allows them to obtain a ballot and to track it. Now you can be confident your absentee ballot has been issued and has been received and has been counted. Moreover, now law enforcement and I can monitor the absentee voting process for any irregularities. It's breathtaking that previously absentee voting could not be supervised by state election officials or law enforcement, but the portal enables that. Third, the signature cure process. In previous elections, many absentee ballots were rejected, simply thrown in the garbage, without notice, without due process, because the signatures on those ballot envelopes didn't match the voter signatures from decades before. Our cure process solved this problem, cutting in half the fail rate of absentee ballots. Absentee voters whose signatures have changed over time now have a chance to prove their identity and have their ballots counted. Fourth, vote centers. Counties have the option to create countywide vote centers where any voter in the county may vote regardless of precinct. In 2020, this method shortened lines, saved tax dollars, and enfranchised voters. Although expanding voting access has been seen typically as a liberal position, it isn't. There is nothing liberal or conservative about helping people get jobs. There is nothing liberal or conservative about helping people get an education. And there is nothing liberal or conservative about helping people vote. We might disagree on the means on any of these policies, but we should not disagree on the ends. The Republican Party, my party in particular, needs to do a better job on this. Historically speaking, the GOP has a great record on this issue. It was Republicans that amended the Constitution to prohibit racial discrimination in voting. It was Republicans who sent federal troops into the South to enforce those rights. It was Republicans who passed the major civil rights legislation of the 20th century. I hope that my party prioritizes voting access. I found that making voting easier is very popular with one particular constituency, voters. Enhanced access is important for voter turnout, but so is election security. If voters think this election is rigged, they're not going to participate. That's why all these improvements that we've made enhance both access and security at the same time. Kentucky voters, Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Independents, everybody, they all have at least one thing in common. They all want to vote. Let's help them. Thank you all so much.
All right, everyone. Now, before we go into questions, I would like to say if there are any students that have an 11 o'clock class, please feel free to exit the side door quietly right there where I'm pointing. Oh, well, y'all have a good day at class.
Thank you. Oh, thanks so much.
Schubert, who actually was what you did that made it easy for my parents to vote.
Oh, I'm glad to hear
My
that.
mom is, she's got
Mm.
immunocompromised, so she's able to go vote early and not have to worry about being in this crowd. So
Thank goodness.
I saw you were speaking and I looked up your campaign and saw what you did. And I was like, wow. I was like, I think I want to be at this.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for coming.
All right, so now we are going to open the floor for any questions for our Secretary of State Adams. I do have a question to kick us off. So my question is, how have you created solutions on ways to support and assist minority communities and people of color that are heavily impacted by the idea of a voter ID?
Well, it was a little bit surprising to folks that I won the election, and then the first meetings I had were with the ACLU and similar organizations on the left. I'm a conservative, and so I made a point to bring those groups in. I wanted to hear what they had to say. I want to get their ideas. I wanted to make sure that this law was in no way discriminatory and didn't keep anyone from voting on any inappropriate rationale. And they actually gave me a lot of good feedback. Part of why I did that was to take pictures of me doing it and put that out to show the entire electorate that I was going to be fair, but also to really listen to them and get some ideas. One thing that I did in the bill was I appropriated $300,000 in there to make IDs free. They used to cost $23 to get an ID, whether it's a driver's license or other ID from the state, it was $23. That's a lot of money to some people. So we ate the cost of that. We made them free. Something else that we did is we provided people pathways if they couldn't get a photo ID. I borrowed an idea from South Carolina's law. They have what's called a reasonable impediment exception. If due to certain things beyond your control, you can't get an ID, there are other ways you can verify your identity. Ultimately, 99% of voters last year voted with a photo ID. About 1% did not. They used some other form of identification. And I think that was a win-win. I think Kentuckians felt confident that our system was fair and free, but we had the highest turnout we've ever had in a Kentucky election for 2 million voters. And so I also feel confident that no one was discriminated against.
Thank you. All right, now we're going to go back and forth between our virtual questions as well as our in-person questions. So for our first virtual question, it is, why are voters allowed to vote with a credit card? If it does not have an ID picture on it, and you cannot prove who they are by credit cards, why are you allowing this?
Well, go read the law. There's a lot of news coverage of it, actually. We passed a law in 2020 to require photo ID to vote. We just talked about that. So whoever sent the question hasn't been keeping up the last couple of years. But the law before I took office didn't require any photo ID. You could use a bank statement, utility bill, a credit card. Unfortunately, that law was many decades old and really didn't keep up with the fact that people have home printer capacity now, and we needed a higher level of security, I thought. So that used to be the laws before I took office. It's one of the big issues that I ran on, and we passed a law to change that.
Okay, thank you. And just a reminder, these are college students and they're still learning, so that's
sure.
most likely why this is occurring. Are there any questions in the audience? Please make sure you all speak into the microphone so that our people can hear us virtually as well.
Is the microphone? Oh, it is. Okay. So during the 2020 election, Jefferson and Fayette County were, can you hear me?
Do we have a mic for the audience at all?
It is a mic. Just speak more
okay.
into it,
Okay,
Jacob.
all right, yeah. So during the 2020 election, both Jefferson and Fayette County, Louisville and Lexington were backed up during absentee voting. To the point where it was like backed up 14,000 absentee mail-in ballots that were just not coming in. Do you have any plans in the future to counter that, like not cause a backup if there is another situation we ran into like 2020?
I couldn't really make out what you were saying, but I think you were asking about long lines in Jefferson and Fayette counties.
Yeah, mainly with like mail-in ballots. Like they weren't, like people would fill out a form, they wouldn't necessarily come in until like 2 weeks, 3 weeks later because it was just so backed up.
So he's saying people were filling out absentee ballots and then their votes weren't getting put in, right, Jacob?
Basically, yeah,
you're
they
saying?
just were not receiving their absentee ballots until
Okay.
days before actual election day.
Well, certainly there were delays in the mail in 2020 due to COVID. Every government agency had to deal with that, deal with employees being out sick, being quarantined because they've been around people who were sick. And so there were delays in the mail system. There weren't delays in our system. There weren't delays at the county clerk's level. They did an amazing job. And they deserve actually way more credit than I do for how smoothly the election went. We don't have an election in Kentucky. We have 120 elections in Kentucky. Each one's run by a county clerk. Jefferson and Fayette, those were both jurisdictions that had on average a much higher utilization of absentee voting. Historically, that's not been the case. That was the case in 2020 because those are the two counties that Hillary Clinton won and Joe Biden won. And because the method people use to vote has recently become a partisan proxy. The Democrats wanted to vote by mail and the Republicans wanted to vote in person. And so you had a lot of, because those are two very Democratic counties, they had a huge number of absentee votes requested in both. But in many cases, people changed their minds. They decided to come vote in person, so we had to resolve that. There were only a smattering of cases where folks never got an absentee ballot. Based on that, though, to make sure no one was disenfranchised, I executed an executive order for those people that if they never got their ballot, they can come vote in person. And if the absentee ballot then came in, it would be canceled and they would not be referred for prosecution for trying to vote twice if they approached us and said, here's the situation, and volunteered that to us. So I'm not aware that anyone didn't get to vote who intended to vote.
All right, thank you. Now we'll go to our next virtual question. What challenges do you expect in making it easier to vote and harder for cheat going forward? What do you think remains to be done?
Well, for starters, we need to implement the bill that we just passed. It's our biggest election reform in 130 years. Think about this for a second. The election laws that I inherited when I was sworn in at the beginning of last year were written in 1891. 1891, that's before cars, that's before electricity, that's before anything that we know from our modern lives. At the time, people didn't go out and get jobs, they worked on the farms. I come from a farm family, nothing against agriculture, but most voters don't live on the farm anymore. They've got time cards, they've got jobs with hours, they've got kids who have things after school. I mean, we just live in a different society today, and our system hadn't really kept up. So just through inertia, they just never got around to improving that system. So that's something I ran on and something I think I've achieved. But I think I need to spend the rest of my term implementing this bill, raising public awareness. That's why I'm here today. Is there isn't much coverage of what Frankfort does here in Northern Kentucky, unfortunately. And so my staff, I've got my communications staff here. We call this a news desert because you get all your news from Cincinnati. They don't cover Kentucky policy adequately. And so it's important that people like me get up here and explain what we're doing in Frankfort. So I want to focus on getting this bill implemented smoothly, working with our clerks and our poll workers, and also making sure the voters understand what their new rights are.
All right, for our next in-person question, can someone who has the mic? Okay, good to go.
So obviously there's been a lot of controversy regarding the 2020 election and election integrity. And I guess my question for you is, do you have any future policies, any future agendas to ensure more election integrity?
Well, again, I think that we need to implement the bill that I just wrote and passed. It's the biggest change in 130 years. I think we need to digest that. I don't have any action items that I think have been undone that I think are critically important. I think we certainly have a really good bill. Let me refer to a couple of things I didn't have in my prepared remarks. We had some additional security improvements in the bill in three respects. One is we banned ballot harvesting. That's a pernicious practice that's led to vote fraud, not just myths on Facebook, but actual criminal convictions for vote fraud in our state and also in other states. I borrowed a law from Arizona that has been upheld this year by the Supreme Court. I borrowed that law almost word for word, and I got the legislature to enact that. A second thing is I asked for and got additional authority to get the voter rolls cleaned up faster. We've taken more dead voters off the rolls in many cases, many months, than we've added live voters. We're about to announce in a press release, we took off 10,000 just last month, about 100,000 total. There's no one who benefits from having dead voters on the rolls. It's an opening for fraud, but it's also making your lines longer than they need to be because it makes the voter rolls inflated. So I had, unfortunately, a need to get some additional authority, and I did ask for that and was given that. And finally, in our bill, we transition our state away from electronic voting machines to paper ballots. I'm not someone who traffics in conspiracy theories about votes being changed electronically. That's nonsense. But the truth is, voters feel more confident voting on a piece of paper. They know they can hold in their hand, know it's right, know that their vote is accurate. And they like the ability of people like me to be able to audit or recount or do what we have to do. You can't audit or recount electronic machines. All you can do is push the button that says the same number. When I took office, we had 29 counties that didn't have a single machine that could process a paper ballot. Today, all 120 counties now have paper ballot capacity. We've been very vigorous chasing down grant dollars and helping our counties upgrade their equipment. But there's more to be done. So this bill actually has a mandate in it that it's not immediate. There's a grandfather clause, but as all the counties upgrade their equipment, they've all got to move to paper. It costs about the same to do paper versus electronic in terms of the cost of the machines, but voters, they trust it. We used to have paper ballots 80 years ago, and they were hand counted. And there was so much fraud and corruption in that process that we moved toward voting machines. So, it's one of those things where the more things change, the more they stay the same. You have to constantly change your technology to keep up with the current reality.
Thank you. And next we'll go to one of our virtual questions. 6 Kentucky senators are now interested in doing a full forensic audit in one county, Jefferson County, because mathematically things are adding up in both the 2019 and 2020 election. Since they are interested in looking into a private auditing firm, what objection would you have to a full forensic audit where they are given access to actual ballots and local routers?
Well, there's an event going on, unfortunately, around the state. It's coming to Campbell County next week. It's an election integrity tour. It's being run by election misinformers, and 2 of your questions today have come from that group. This is one of them. Let me just address this. There's an old urban legend from a couple of years ago that our machines were hacked and the election was stolen from Matt Bevin and given to Andy Beshear. And the conspiracy theory is always that the machines are cheating Republicans, not Democrats. I don't know how that would be if they're just machines, they're not partisan. But anyway, that's the theory. And this all comes from one little clip on CNN on election night, the night that I won, and every other Republican on the ballot won, except for the governor. There's a little clip on CNN where the vote total that Matt Bevin had and the vote total that Andy Beshear had flip all of a sudden. And people assume that CNN has a wire that plugs into our election machines and they're getting a live feed. That's not what that is. CNN doesn't count the votes. Neither does Fox News or anyone else. We count the votes in the Capitol. When you see that sort of a thing, that's just some intern typed the number wrong on the screen and then fixed it. That's not the official election results. If you notice, on election night, you get quicker results from the news networks than you get from the state. There's a reason for that. It's because our numbers are accurate. And their numbers, they're trying to be fast, not right. So based on that misinterpretation of a mistake made by CNN in typing a number on a screen, this has led to this whole silly movement of people saying that the elections are being hacked. And that's just nonsense. Our election machines are not on the internet.
Thank you. Do we have any more in-person questions? All right, the mic is coming to you now.
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering if you have any concerns about future elections, whether it be 2022 or 2024 or further, if this sort of questioning election results continues.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I'm getting paid to have concerns. I'm paid to worry. To give you a sense of how the ball, this is a constantly moving target. I was sworn in January of last year. The first big thing I had was a national conference of secretaries of state in Washington in the month I was sworn in. And so we all flew to Washington and we had like a 3 or 4 day long set of meetings talking about cybersecurity. And this was in response to, in 2016, no systems were hacked and no votes were changed, but there were attempts by foreign adversaries to get into our voter registration systems. No votes were touched, no registration information was changed, but they love rattling our doorknob and getting us nervous. That's happened here in Kentucky. No one's accessed anything, but they try. So we spent the whole time dealing with cybersecurity. Well, then of course, 2 months later, you're dealing with COVID. And so generals always fight the last war, right? The real challenge we have is you got to watch all the problems that you've seen in elections previously, and then you have to try to predict what the new problem is going to be. So it's a perpetual challenge.
Thank you. All right, our next question virtually. I would like to ask the Secretary of State why we paid $25,000 to ERIC, who is supposed to be the nonprofit, but yet they will not allow Kentucky clerks to have access to the list to make sure our county voters' rolls are correct. County clerks should have access, or the state of Kentucky should not be paying $25,000 of taxpayers' money to this.
I think you have some non-students getting in your questions. There's an organization called ERIC. It's an acronym. We, under a federal judge's order, are required to belong to this organization, and here's why. It's about 30 states that have formed a partnership, and they cross-check their voter lists. Because I'll tell you myself, I lived in Kentucky, voted here, then I moved to Virginia for some period of time and voted there. I didn't know that I was on the rolls here. I just assumed the states talked to each other. Well, previously, Kentucky wasn't part of that interstate compact. Now we are. And it's not because I want us to be, although I do, it's because there's a federal judicial order from several years ago requiring us to be in it. My predecessor was sued and lost in federal court on allegations that she had not adequately maintained the voter rolls, and she was ordered by a judge to join this organization. So we joined this organization. The question was, why don't the clerks have access to this? The answer is because that's not what the law says. My job is to honor the Constitution and the laws, and the law says that it's the state that joins ERIC. If the clerks joined it, then they'd have to pay to join it, and that would be inefficient.
Thank you. Are there any other in-person questions? Melody, where's the mic? You got it. Okay.
Hello, thank
Hi.
you so much for being here. Regarding your voter ID bill, some people would think it is restrictive to have voter ID, especially for transgender individuals, because it can be hard to get your name and your birth sex changed on legal documents. Is there anything in your bill to protect transgender voters?
Well, not by name, not specifically, but again, we made our office open to any folks that wanted to come in and raise concerns with us. And we had the highest turnout we've ever had in the Kentucky election, and I didn't get a single criticism in our office, any constituent mail or calls or anything else from any voter that felt that they were unable to vote for any reason. Again, we built not specifically for one demographic, but we built mechanisms into the bill to provide alternative forms of voter identity proof other than photo ID if necessary. Ultimately, only 1% of voters needed that. 99% were able to vote with a driver's license or other photo ID.
Okay, thank you.
All right, now our next virtual question. Just a heads up, you all, we have about 5-7 minutes left. How can ordinary citizens address the Restore Election Integrity campaign being carried on by our own state senators, by our former president, and by some of the media? What specific steps can we take to address the specific misinformation being pushed out on YouTube and conversations on social media?
Well, thank you for that question. This is a reference to a sort of a roadshow that's ongoing. It's sponsored by a state senator who's engaged in misinformation. You can Google this. Don't take it from me. Go read for yourself. The best thing you can do is just tell the truth. That's what I do, is just explain what we do and why we do it and how we do it, and just be transparent. That's a challenge that I've got. It's harder in an era when it's hard to speak in front of audiences because of COVID. But let me leave you with this. I think I've done about as good a job as I can do in being candid and being forthcoming with folks. But ultimately, there are people that will never trust me because I'm a statewide official or a politician or whatever you want to call it, and they don't know me personally. They just see me on television. The best thing those folks can do is talk to the county clerk, because they know the county clerks. In many cases, they go to church with them or they went to high school with them or whatever. Talk to your county clerk. Talk to your poll workers. Part of why our elections are clean is it's not just what we've done, it's stuff that's already built into the system. You have a Republican Secretary of State that worked across the aisle, but you've also got a state board of elections of 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans that work together across the aisle. In every single county in our state, you've got a county board of elections that is a sheriff and a clerk and 1 Democrat and 1 Republican. So every single county at that level, they're bipartisan running the elections. Every single precinct in our state, by law, every single precinct's got to have at least 1 D and at least 1 R at it. So in terms of this talk about all this election theft going on, I mean, who are these Republicans? Who are the clerks? Who are the poll workers? The Board of Elections members that are part of this? That's ridiculous. And same with the Democrats. They're not up to this either. Checks and balances, separation of powers, all that good stuff that we talk about on Constitution Day. That's built into our election system as well. This is, I was complaining about this sort of on the way in that, Northern Kentucky, gosh, you don't get a lot of TV coverage of Kentucky issues. You don't get a lot of print coverage of Kentucky issues. And this part of the state is more, unfortunately, subject to misinformation in other parts of the state because you don't really have legitimate voices frequently to counteract that. And so people don't have news sources, so they go on social media. And any random kook with an internet connection suddenly becomes an authority figure. So I would urge you to be civically literate. Talk to the people who actually do this stuff. Talk to your poll workers. Talk to your county clerk. Talk to the people who actually run these elections. If you want to know what's really going on, not some nut job on social media.
Thank you. Do we have any other in-person questions?
So as you know, the 2022 midterms are coming up, and you have senators like Rand Paul that are up for reelection. Are you going to help him campaign for reelection? And if you are, is voter integrity going to be a campaign issue that he will run with?
Oh, I can't speak for Senator Paul's campaign, what issues he's going to run on. I have no idea. I'm not involved in campaigns. Here's what I can tell you. There's no Republican that has done more to help improve voting access in our state than Rand Paul. And here's how. Rand Paul helped me put together this bill. Rand Paul wanted the portal. Rand Paul wanted early voting. Rand Paul helped me lobby legislators to get them to pass this bill, Republican legislators who control the legislature in Frankfurt. So I don't know that I'll have any role in the campaign. I usually don't get involved in campaigns because I'm the guy that counts the votes, right? I typically stay out of those races. But if I'm asked, as I have been today, I'll say that I think the senator has a great record on that issue. I don't know if he'll be running on it. I think it's his call on what issues he thinks resonate the best for him, but he's got a great record on this issue. He's one of the, I talked about the Republican Party in my remarks. Kentucky Republicans are different. Senator McConnell supported what we did. Senator Paul supported what we did. The Republican legislators, almost all of them, all but only a handful, supported what we did. And I've tried to actually take this case national, and I've lobbied Republicans in other states to pay attention to what we're doing here. It's been very well received.
Thank you. And now we'll have our last question for the day. If the machines don't touch the internet, why did you tell 10 Kentucky House leaderships to hold Senate Bill 63 up until the session expired?
Well, you must have the most informed students I've ever seen. My goodness, these questions. So this is unfortunately part of a myth out there. There was a bill in the legislature this year, Senate Bill 63. It required that the election machines not be on the internet. Well, they're not on the internet now. And I'm fine with that. I'm happy to pass the bill, and I'm actually working on another bill for next year that will have similar language. But there were other defects in the language. Our office was not consulted on the bill. It made other changes that wouldn't have been functional. It would have functionally prohibited the current machines that we do have that work very well, that our voters have confidence in, our paper ballot machines. And so we asked that we have a chance to actually be involved in drafting that bill. And so I'm working on that now with legislators to have a good bill. But unfortunately, that bill just wasn't up to snuff.
Thank you. All right. Do you have any closing remarks for us today?
Just this, two requests of you. Number one, obviously register to vote. But number two, be a poll worker. I started working the polls when I was about your age, 19 or so. Really fun experience, really enjoyed it, learned a lot. The biggest problem we had in 2020 that forced so many changes, many of them I think good ultimately, but those changes were made under duress because we just didn't have places to go vote or people to man the polls. You go vote, who's there? They're all, no offense, but they're all sweet old ladies and sweet old men, and God bless them for being civic minded and volunteering, but they're not going to be able to volunteer forever. When I was elected in 2019, a couple of weeks after that, I was invited to testify to the legislature about the challenges that we face and my agenda and so forth. And I told them, this is in 2019, before anyone ever heard of coronavirus. I told them we've got a crisis with our poll workers. We don't have enough. We've got too many places where we're missing a poll worker. And again, by law, you got to have at least one D and one R at every polling location. Well, because we're getting more polarized, Jefferson and Fayette are getting bluer, and there's fewer Republicans to be poll workers. In most of the rest of the state, there's too few Democrats. But the larger issue is generational. I'm a Gen Xer. My generation has really dropped the ball. We don't volunteer for stuff. We don't join stuff. That's part of what's wrong with today's society is people are dropping out of groups, churches, civic groups, where they meet people who aren't like them and learn to tolerate each other. And they're just retreating to their social media caves and attacking each other. And that's bad for our country in lots of ways. But one of those ways is people don't volunteer civically. And we can't run elections without that. I did a video last year and I said, dear Democrats, if you don't want vote suppression, if you don't want us to close the polls and keep you from coming out to vote, then please be a poll worker, volunteer. I told Republicans, hey, look, you don't like mail-in voting, you want to have in-person voting, we can't have it without you, go be a poll worker. I can't do everything. I don't get any tax dollars from the General Assembly. We're self-sufficient in revenue that we generate in our office from business services. I don't have an army of people that work for me, it's about 30. I don't have poll workers. Y'all gotta be the poll workers. I need your help.
Thank you. Now, we would like to thank both audiences, the Secretary of State, and to our co-hosts for coming out today. Northern Kentucky University's Common Experience and the Northern Kentucky University Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement helped co-host today. And our co-sponsors, the Northern Kentucky Forum and the Kentucky Campus Act. A shout out to the Kids Voting NKY. If you have not let kids voting know that you would like to volunteer, you can still do so on your way out. Thank you, Secretary of State Adams. We appreciate your visit to help us celebrate Constitution Day. And you all may now exit the room. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.